Kia ora. Welcome everybody to today's webinar, where we'll be looking at rights management. Today I'll be covering how you can record and manage rights negotiation in Vernon CMS, and I'll also be pointing you to some other useful external resources. Copyright describes the rights that are held in creative works, including photography, artwork, patents, and technical designs. These rights can be recorded in the rights table of the object record. You can also note rights that have been granted to you in the same table. Lastly, you can also record other types of rights in that table, including cultural permissions that may be related to Indigenous works. If you don't own the copyright of a work, then a license is ideally agreed at the time you acquire it. And this can be in negotiation with the copyright holder, perhaps at a later date if it wasn't agreed at the time when you first had the work donated or purchased. The copyright table within Vernon can also hold a history over time, as copyright might expire and rights for use might be renegotiated as well at another point in time. Firstly, I'll just point you to a couple of useful external resources. Te Papa, the National Museum of New Zealand, have a great section on legal compliance. As part of that, there's a subsection on copyright with a really useful resource guide covering all the key things that you need to consider. If I open up that resource guide, we can see that it covers a whole lot of different points in the process, including a really useful section on how you go about obtaining the copyright to copy a work. So anything where somebody has created a work and they still own the legal copyright, restricting who can make copies of that, you have to negotiate with that rights holder so that you have permission to do certain things with that object. And that includes making digital copies to share on an online website. The second resource that I'm going to show is a blog post from Auckland Museum, where they've gone into great detail documenting their process for managing rights, both things where they own the copyright and things where they've had to negotiate rights with some other rights holder. One important element of their work is that their works are what they call open by default. So things where they own the copyright of the item, they've chosen licensing that allows the maximum possible reuse of that content. And they're using the Creative Commons International Licensing Framework to allow other people to reuse and modify that content. So that's things like photographs that they've taken of their social history collection. So I'll swap now to our Vernon CMS demo system, and we'll walk through some examples of where we would record this information. In this example, I've got a fan vase. It was made by the Auckland Pottery, Crown Lynn, and it was a mass-produced item. We've taken our own photograph of this specific vase, and we own the copyright of that specific image. We could go into the acquisition, provenance, and rights subpage, and we could record the rights that we know about that item. So that's showing up on the right-hand side, and on the second tab is where we've got the rights table. So we've recorded that the rights holder is Vernon Systems and the year at which those rights started. That's the year in which we took the photograph that we own the rights for. We can record rights for other types of items in the collection, so not just accessioned works. We might also have items where somebody else owns the copyright, and this is a typical example. The artist that produced this particular painting is still alive and owns the copyright of the albatross work, and so we can see here we've got two entries in the rights table. We've marked that Pauline Thompson, the artist, is still the copyright holder, and under New Zealand licensing law, that copyright will stay until 70 years after the artist's death. And then we've also negotiated rights with that artist to allow us to share low resolution copies of that on our online collection. And so we've noted details of that. Some of the works in our demo collection are works that we've temporarily borrowed. So for example, this Rodney Funston print. The same concepts still apply though. So even though it's an inward loan, we can still go into the rights table and record that information. Rights, however, might extend beyond basic copyright law. There are other types of rights that you might need to consider. For example, this African sculpture has some cultural rights that we might need to note. And so I've noted that although this work was created far enough back that it's no longer in copyright in terms of it being a creative work, there are cultural permissions that apply. And so I've noted that this has particular significance to a tribal group, and I've noted some concerns that they have about how that item should be used in the future. And so then as the collection holder, you then have to consider those rights when you're producing exhibitions, storing and handling those individual artworks. That rights negotiation can be complex, and so we might want to document the actual process that you went through to confirm the rights. And so there's a few places we can use in Vernon CMS to record that. Firstly, for a record with cultural permissions, we could flag that it has certain restrictions. And so in the administration page, there's a restriction type field, and we could use that field to record categories like that it's culturally sensitive. And that could be something that you're searching on when you're helping plan an exhibition. Secondly, we might have electronic documentation that resulted from that copyrights negotiation process. We could link those electronic documents in the documentation references page. I don't have a PDF in this case, but this is where we would go to click into the external file field and link to any PDFs we had. So there might be a signed agreement, which we could scan and then link to the particular record that it related to. Next, we have the option of documenting individual elements of correspondence in Vernon CMS's correspondence file. So that's one of the main files on the left, and I can go to correspondence identification. So in our system, we've noted the details of a specific email that went from us to Pauline Thompson about those rights. So I could search for her name up in the top search bar and find that correspondence record. Each correspondence record notes one item of correspondence, and that could link to many different records in the system. So in this case, this was a discussion about rights for the 3 different artworks that we hold of Pauline Thompson's in our demo collection. And so I've noted that we received an email on a specific date where she returned back the license agreement. So that's a file where you could note particularly important elements of correspondence where you want a permanent history of that conversation within Vernon CMS. Beyond the core cataloging module, there's the optional activities module, which tracks all of these processes in a lot more detail. So if I scroll down on the left, we can see all of the different processes which we can manage through the activities file. And that includes managing inward and outward rights. So inward rights is where somebody like Pauline Thompson has granted us rights. Outward rights is when we've granted somebody outside of the organisation some rights to use an object in a particular way or to copy an object in a certain way. So somebody might have to negotiate with us to get permission for an image that we've created and own the copyright for and haven't currently released as something where people can reuse it without negotiation. And so those 2 files are the inward rights reproduction and use file and the outward rights file. So as well as rights, that's covering use. So there might be a researcher that comes into the collection and he might want to document their access or use of a particular item, and the same activity file can be used for that. So let's open up the inward rights file. And again, I've got an example relating to that same albatross artwork. Two key things with the activities module are that there's a procedural status field that says at what point that particular process is up to in its life cycle. So we can start tracking these processes before they've been completed, rather than just preserving a history of things that have already happened. So in this case, I've marked that this is at permission requested stage, and we haven't yet received the confirmation back from Pauline. We can then describe what are the elements of that process. So it's a copyright that we're negotiating. We can describe when that happened. We can describe the different people that are involved. And we can describe other things like, why are we negotiating this? So this was a request that was done so that we could reuse this material on a website. In the activities module, you can do things like automatically trigger emails at certain points. So there might be a photographer that's involved that needs to be flagged at a certain status point. And you can also automatically generate reports. So you could generate a license agreement at some point in this process, which is then signed and saved back into the system as a scanned PDF file. Like we saw with the correspondence file, one single activity record can link to many objects. So this might be a process where you're negotiating the rights of all of the works that you hold of one particular maker or artist. We can also consider how this information is going to be presented through an online website. So if you're publishing some of this information on your online collection, you might have to consider how you're flagging those rights within each individual record. If I go back to that albatross record, we can see that we've got a history of rights in the rights table. We might choose to publish just the first row of that table and mark that as the current rights, because that's automatically sorted by dates. And we might choose to change the wording of the actual rights type so that it's something that's more meaningful to the public user. So we can see that I've flagged that as copyright owner. But if I go to the related authority term record, we do have the option of putting alternative names for that term, and those alternative names might be what we actually publish on the website. So that term is called copyright owner, and I've got a long name which I've called all rights reserved. And so if we were publishing that to any online system, including Vernon browser, this might be the specific field that gets published along with every catalogue record. If I switch to my web browser, we can see an example of how a client's made use of exactly that process. So publishing just the top row of the rights table and just the alternative public version of each of those rights types. So this is the search results on the Sargent Gallery website. The search results filters have common things which we might want to use to narrow down our search. So maybe just a particular artist. But one of the search filters they've used is the current rights. So that's taking that public display of each term that's in the first row of the rights table. And so we can then very quickly see of the search results, what are we legally allowed to do with that material? So much of it is all rights reserved. So the artist still owns the copyright and hasn't granted any generic rights to public users. But there are a handful of items which are copyright orphans, where it's probably still in copyright, but they haven't been able to negotiate or find the rights holder. And there's also a large block where they're out of copyright. So works that were created a particularly long time ago, they're out of copyright, and then we can publicly reuse any of that material. So I could narrow down the search just to ones where there's no copyright, and they'll be predominantly older works. So this is a work created in the 1850s. It's no longer in copyright, and I could reuse that image if I wished. Also on the website, they're very clear about what those different rights categories mean. And so that's all described on a terms page. And so that's something we'd commonly do on our Vernon browser sites. We'd create a terms of use page using whatever wording the client's wanting us to add on that page. And then if I click on that, we can see each of those different rights types within layperson's language, what we can do with the material under each of those different categories. So clearly saying that the all rights reserved category, for instance, covers images that can't be reused in any way. One of the concepts we saw was Auckland Museum making use of the Creative Commons licensing framework. So Creative Commons is an international project to create standard licenses which have all of the legal terms already built into it, as well as a layperson, easy-to-read version of that. And so if we look at the different licensing options, so Creative Commons by license is the most common. So that just means people are allowed to reuse that material as long as they credit where it came from. So they just have to have an attribution to say who was that material originally created by. And so that's the simple language of that license, but I can click on that link and I can get to a more detailed version. And I can link to the actual full legal code if I wished, which will describe in international law what are all of the considerations of that particular license type. So that's a whole framework where somebody's put in effort into all of those different licensing levels. And it's a system that really encourages the reuse of content. So where you own the copyright of an item, we'd really encourage you to either make it no rights reserved or to use a Creative Commons license so that the general community can get the most benefit out of that material when they discover it. One other resource that I wanted to point you to is from the UK. So their national advisory organisation and museum support organisation is called Collections Trust. And again, they've created a whole resource around the process of managing rights. So that gives you links to a whole lot of external toolkits, as well as guides to very specific processes. So that concept of orphan works, where you haven't been able to locate the rights holder, they've got a small guide that describes, well, how do you deal with that? And so one approach is to publish the records for online collections where it's an orphan work, but to clearly state that it's an orphan work in the hope that you'll discover the copyright holder. And that's often the case. People will then find this item in a collection and they might be a descendant of the copyright holder, and then you'll actually be able to start the process of either negotiating the rights or checking whether the rights have since expired. So that gives you an overview of the features that are available within Vernon for both tracking and recording rights, and a link to some third-party resources.